Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey folks, welcome to episode 271 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy here with Dave Park. Tonight on the show we have Ben McKelvey. He is the author of Find, Fix, Finish. He's also the author of Mosul and The Commando. We're going to be mostly talking about this book tonight, which is about the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, some heroic actions that they took, and also some allegations of war crimes that we're going to go deep into. Right before we get into that, I just want to give a shout out to our Patreon, and I'd ask folks out there listening or viewing this, click the link down in the description for our Patreon and consider sponsoring the show, supporting the channel. You get access to all of these episodes ad-free when you sign up, and we really appreciate you guys helping this thing keep chugging along. So thank you. Ben, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Hey guys, how are you?
Doing real good. Early morning there in Australia.
Yeah, it's a beautiful autumnal day in Bondi Beach. Sunny and gorgeous.
So, Ben, before we get into the book, I want to ask you a little bit about your background, how you came into journalism, how you came specifically into, Australian military national security journalism.
Yeah. I actually just wrote a book about how I got into journalism and how I got into that national security stuff. I had an aphasic stroke when I was 27. So I was working in a magazine and I was boxing at the time, and then all of a sudden I couldn't speak. I couldn't comprehend language, couldn't read, couldn't write. Went to hospital.
Oh my God.
Had a sort of recovery of a number of months. Going back into comic books and young adult novels and really sort of building up language skills.
Oh my God.
And then I had done all that, and I was sort of conceiving a life outside of the journalism life that I already had. I was working at a men's magazine. I was having a lot of fun with my friends. I had actually done a little bit of work with the Commandos. I'd gone and done their barrier test for a story, and then I'd also done a sort of exercise with them and the Incident Response Regiment, which was later SOA, the Special Operations Engineering Regiment. And I'd gone to East Timor and an embed, and I'd done a few little bits and pieces, but that's what I really wanted to do. And eventually I petitioned to the Australian Defence Force to go to Iraq with them as an embed. And then while I was waiting on that request, which I thought was a Hail Mary, given where I was working, what I was doing, I had a heart attack. And it was a STEMI heart attack, so it was kind of like a pretty serious incident, and I had to have some open heart surgeries afterwards, and then I recovered from the last surgery, and I was, I'm 96 kilos or something. I was in the 60s after the surgery. I was thin and ill and couldn't even walk up my street. And then I got an email from the Defence Force saying, "Okay, come to Iraq," in a few weeks' time. And I went to my cardiologist. I went to my surgeon and said, I thought he was going to tell me, "You can't do this." And he's like, "Live your life," which is a very sort of surgeon attitude. They're like, "I fixed you." He's like, "My work is good. You go to Iraq." And then that sort of started it for me. I went to Iraq, and then independently I worked as a freelancer and went to Iran and Syria and Afghanistan for other bits and pieces. And then I worked, the thing that really accelerated me in that space was working on a biography of Cameron Baird, who you're aware of, Jack.
Yeah.
How did you know of Cam, or did you know Cam? Did you have any interactions with him?
No, I never met him. I knew of him through some of his teammates and people in the Commandos who knew him, and they told me stories about how he'd camo up like the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
And he was big about charging out there and wanted the enemy to see him and shoot at him so he could shoot back, just like a larger than life kind of figure.
He really was. I remember one of the first interviews that I did with one of his COs was he always knew when they got out of the helicopters which one was Beardy, because the soldiers were sort of moving forward in a relatively uniform fashion, and then Beatty was just like, "Chow!" He was just off being a bullet magnet, you know. But there was this, the Special Operations Task Group, which was Australia's Special Forces commitment to the war in Afghanistan, was large and very kinetic, but not known about much in Australia at all. No one had been embedded with the Special Forces. We had this protected identity status law, meaning that they couldn't legally speak to journalists about what they were doing, and that was the Commandos and the SASR, meaning and SOA and everybody else associated. So there was really a dearth of information as to what the Australians had been doing in Afghanistan. And then when I got the contract to do the book about Cameron Baird, the posthumous book about Cameron Baird, who'd been killed in combat, I went to Holsworthy and started interviewing the guys, and I was completely shocked. I had no idea. I kind of felt that I had sort of been paying attention to what had been happening in the war in Afghanistan, and it was a completely different story. And that was a thread that I sort of pulled and have been doing that all the way to Find Fix Finish.
So you feel that the Australian people were fairly naive about the intensity of the combat that their soldiers were getting into?
Yeah, I mean, not just that. There was a failure not only within the public, but on a political level, to understand just the basic tenor of the conflict. I mean, even now, my pet peeve is there'll be a news report about the commandos on the drug job that they had done. A historical news report might be related to war crimes or something else. And then uniformly, when they're talking about a gunfight, they refer to the Afghans as Taliban. And, sometimes they were fighting the Taliban and sometimes they weren't. It just, I knew so little. I realized when I started that book that I knew so little. And that meant that most people in Australia knew so little about the conflict that we'd sort of been heavily involved in, and we only sort of understood after the fact.
I'm just curious for you, because we've talked to American journalists who were in beds with U.S. forces. How were you received when you first showed up, and what was your relationship like with not only the command structures but the individual soldiers themselves?
I think I was received better than most because on my body armor I just slapped a Ralph sticker, which had a sort of half-naked woman on the sticker, and soldiers almost uniformly had Ralph posters, in tanks and on their lines, and so journalists from ABC or 2GB or something like that, they don't really give a shit, but it's like, oh, it's the Ralph guy. It's like, I know what that outlet is. So the story that I ended up doing, I did a piece for Ralph, and then I did a piece for the West Australian newspaper and a piece for the Bulletin, which was Australia's version of Newsweek at the time. I did a piece that was really a soldier's eye view of things, which up to Find Fix Finish was sort of the way that I operated, was from the perspective of a soldier who's on the ground, because I want to know what they know. And then maybe I'll bring in some information about, contextually where they are. But that's where I really started from a biography background, and that was my perspective up until Find Fix Finish.
So to jump into Find Fix Finish, if you can take us a little bit back in time to a little history lesson that you write about in your book, about there's this large span of time for the Special Air Service Regiment between the Vietnam conflict where they served and the global war on terror. Could you tell us about the sort of like pre-global war on terror Special Air Service, what their mission was, what their culture was, and then leading us into the Tampa?
Yeah. Well, in Vietnam, they had sort of earned this moniker, the Ghosts of the Jungle. They were sort of, they were special forces as you would understand them to be. They'd disappear and reappear and kill, and no one would know where they'd been. And they really kind of had this this sort of dangerous kinetic mission. And then after Vietnam, there was a defence white paper, an Australian defence white paper, which is kind of a big deal. It only happens every sort of 10 to 15 years or something. And I think the guy's name was Paul Dibb wrote this white paper about the defence of Australia, and there was a structure of the Australian Defence Force that was dedicated on the defence of Australia, which seems sort of, obvious and it sort of makes sense. But that meant that we didn't have much capacity for force projection. And within a Defence of Australia structure, the SAS would sort of primarily be engaged with doing guerrilla warfare in Northern Australia, which is not particularly populated. And there was even a program where they were working with Indigenous Australians to do,
really?
demolitions and things like that. Yeah, there's still a group up there called North Force that they get guys who sort of traditional owners of land and then engage them to, to work in comms or in demolitions.
Like sleeper cells.
Yeah, that's right. For guys who like really understand the really uninhabited areas of Australia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the SASR, that ended up becoming their job, but there was, outside of a few little missions, East Timor was a time where they were like seriously engaged, but they, one of the quotes in the book is that they just spent a lot of time wandering around in the desert counting train cars. They'd sort of secrete themselves into a position and watch a train go by and then come back, and that'd be their
because their main mission at the time was strategic reconnaissance. Yeah,
basically, that's right. In Australia as well, which is a large empty place. So, it just meant being really good at being out for a long time and then coming back and coming back with information or whatever the job was at the time. But the guys who were within the regiment, there was a lot of people who it just wasn't an engaging role for them. It was sort of preparing for something that they thought probably was never going to happen, and it wasn't a particularly explosive job. But then Tampa happened. So Tampa was a ship that nearly came into Australian waters with a lot of refugees. So refugees, and they were mostly Afghan, had come on an Indonesian fishing vessel to try and come to Australia illegally. And then their ship started to sink, and they put out an SOS call. And then the Tampa came and rescued them, and then a lot of them were sick. So the law of the sea is that they need to be brought to Australia so they can be given medical treatment. But there was a lot of political toing and froing at the moment, then and actually at the moment, about illegal migrants coming into Australia, and they had set up a policy where they weren't going to let anyone come into Australia. So when the Tampa decided that they were going to come to Christmas Island, which is a territory in Australia, the government told them they couldn't. And then there ended up being this standoff. And then the SAS were actually sent to storm the ship because erroneously there were reports that, some of the refugees, I don't think there were reports that they were armed, but that they might have been dangerous. And, they all had gastro and they were all lying on the deck and they were all exhausted and sick, and they'd been at sea for weeks and weeks. So the SAS ended up storming Tampa, and there were some leaked photos and video of it, and it all looked very, very dramatic. But in the book, I sort of marked that as the moment where the SAS, to a certain extent, became a political tool, because only a few weeks later, 9/11 happened. And as soon as 9/11 happened, the guys at Campbell Barracks, where the SAS are, started preparing for a mission to go into Afghanistan. And they were one of the first forces after the Marines secured. I can't remember which base it is. I'm sure you guys remember.
Was it Bagram or Kandahar?
No, it was in Kandahar. Yeah.
Okay. Well, talk to us a little bit about the early GWAT years in Afghanistan, where the Special Air Service really did some quality work, in my opinion, based on what I read in your book.
Yeah. I mean, basically they would. Like you said, they were doing reconnaissance, and they would. There were a few instances where they were working with the Marines primarily, with Mathis, and he really loved their work because they would go out for such a long time. They would have reconnaissance teams that would go out for I can't 10, 20 days, and I think some of the SASR teams went out for 50 or 60 days. In these sort of open top vehicles in the freezing cold, but they were so happy to get the work that they were just they were happy to, to just keep going and going. And then they had done a lot of instances where they had identified targets, sat there, waited, looked at the pattern of life, sent all the information back, and then there were either strikes or there weren't strikes, or a larger force had come in and prosecute the targets. And they had done all that, and then they were given a role that ended up being relatively integral in Operation Anaconda, and where Roberts Ridge and all of that activity happened. But the primary Australian force was working as a blocking force with other international special forces. But there was one team that was in this position that was just sort of perfect for bringing in air and ordnance, and they did that day after day after day after day after day, without having any direct confrontation with the enemy, but bringing in this ordnance. But that was at the time a sort of perfect SAS mission. That's what they were really good at, and they had executed that really well. But that sort of mission moves on because technology moves on. With drones and the sort of satellite technology that we have now, you don't need as much of that. So then their capabilities and their missions changed.
And so with that, if we fast forward a few years, what is it? Urzgan province.
Yeah.
Talk to us about Sasser landing in that province. Their first ops in April 2006, and then their relationship with the Dutch, who were also in charge of that sector.
Yeah, I mean the Dutch came in a little later. So Australia had put their hand up to say that they would be part of ISAF, of the International Security Assistance Force, but we didn't know, or the Australian government didn't know exactly where that force was going to end up and what the composition of it was going to be. But there was a suggestion that they would go to Urzgan, and there's a couple of quotes in the book about they just weren't prepared for a province like Urzgan, perhaps, or that they didn't know necessarily what they were going into, the Australian government, because Urzgan is, along with Kandahar, it's sort of one of the heartlands of the Taliban. It's where Mullah Omar was from. That's where his village is. So they sent the SASR in to do some ground truthing, and there's a story in the book about an element going up to the northwest corner of Urzgan, and they see some locals, and they're sort of like, "Hey, how you going?" And then all of a sudden, there's just RPGs and bullets, and these were just locals who were aggrieved with the Australians coming into Urzgan. They end up being this massive gunfight. They end up bringing in Apaches. The whole thing. I mean, this is just meant to be a hey, how you going with the locals ground truthing mission. And then they come back to Tarancot, and when they do, the Australian Defence Minister Robert Hill is there, and he sees all the shot-up vehicles and bloodied soldiers. None of the Australian SASR guys are killed, but there's a lot of injuries, and he has never spoken about this, but he retired from his position a few weeks later, and the speculation was that he had always had an issue with Australia's involvement in Iraq. And that he didn't think that it was within Australia's strategic interest to be involved in Iraq, is my understanding. But there is speculation that he saw what the Afghan mission was going to be for the Australians in the sort of years to come, and he was perhaps, and this is not something I did actually speak to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister at that time. It's not something that they would speak to me about, but there may have been issues within the National Security Cabinet as to whether Australia should have had that role in Afghanistan. And then the SAS. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to ask. I mean, as things develop, the SAS ends up in this capture-kill mission, but the Dutch have a different approach that's more hearts and minds oriented.
Yeah, the Dutch mission was very much. There had to be a political mandate for the things that they were going to do. And with the way that the Dutch government was constructed at the time, there were a lot of left-leaning parties that had influence into what ended up being the Dutch operations. So that was part of the reason why they weren't comfortable doing kill capture. But the other issue is that or it wasn't an issue, it was a boon to them. They had these sort of anthropologists they had a lot of people at this place called the Liaison Organization that were giving them really great intel into the way that the tribal structure worked in Uruzgan. And so they were sort of suggesting to the Dutch forces that endlessly attacking the enemies of the warlord that we have associated ourselves with, which was a guy called Jan Muhammad Khan, and then a guy called Matiullah Khan afterwards. He said, you're just going to create more conflict. And so they didn't necessarily believe in the American mission that was sort of maximalist and more kinetic than the Dutch thought it should be. And then the Australians put their hand up and they were like, yeah, we'll do that. Sounds good.
And talk to us a little bit about how those ops get stood up. June in your book, June 2nd, 2006, there's an operation where a Special Air Service operator, Ben Robert Smith, is said to have killed a teenager during an engagement, maybe legitimately, maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of integral and important moment in the history of Australia's engagement in Afghanistan, because this was a sort of combined ops. This is when they were working with the Dutch. And the idea of that op was there's a valley coming into Tarankot, which is where the multinational base is and where the provincial capital is. But there were a lot of opposing forces. Some of them were associated with the centralized insurgency, but a lot of them were the enemies of this warlord, Jan Muhammad Khan at the time. And Shora and Baluchi came through to a place called Darafshan, which was sort of on the plain, very close to Tarankot. And so you basically had this non-permissive area that was leading into the capital. So the idea was that they would clear Chora out. They'd have this large operation, and they'd have this force push through all the way through to Tarankot, and there'd be a series of battles, and they'd take control of this area. And the Afghans and the Dutch would sort of seize these areas, put up patrol bases, and then we'd have a permissive environment close to where the multinational base is and where the provincial capital is. Incidentally, they ended up fighting in that area consistently, all the way through. Basically, there were periods of peace and periods of war, but it never ended up becoming a sort of a wholly permissive area. But Ben Robert Smith was sent up to be part of a patrol that was going to be doing an overwatch, which is not dissimilar to the Overwatch mission that Matthew Bullion, who was the guy who was the patrol leader for the mission Operation Anaconda, not dissimilar to that. Sent up, hang out, have a little spot, see what's happening down there, send intel back, perhaps bring ordnance in if you have to, and then secrete your way back. But this is the subject of a defamation case at the moment, so we can't specifically know what happened, but an armed or unarmed, actually I think they've agreed that it's unarmed, but may or may not have been a spotter, a teenage kid walks across, perhaps preteen, walks across the observation post, and they decide to go and find him and kill him. And they do that, and then that starts an engagement, and they have to sort of fight their way back, which they do, and they end up bringing in air support, and so the fight ends up, the center of gravity of the fight ends up being at the top of the mountain, not down in the valley where it's meant to be. But depending on who you speak to, that was sort of an integral and valorous moment within the SASR, and people were given medals afterwards. And some people have suggested that sort of set a precedent for within the SASR in Afghanistan, because that perhaps could be seen as a strategic negative moment, and yet people were awarded medals for it afterwards.
And then you also, as going forward a little bit in time, you have the creation of the Special Operations Task Force, SOTG, which brings in the commandos. Could you talk to us a little bit about the role of the commandos, their history, their mission, and the rift that developed between them and the SAS?
Yeah. I mean, most of my friends are within the commando regiment in that space. They are a force that is, they were designed to work hand in glove with the SASR, probably in the way, I mean, you definitely know better than I, in the way that the Rangers were they meant to be a cooperative force with JSOC?
They were not initially stood up for that reason, but I mean, they kind of became that, right? They became, when you need a lot of manpower to do things
Yeah.
that a small specialized unit can't do, yeah, you call the Rangers.
Yeah, and do they work sometimes as a cordon force and
Or direct action and
direct action?
to strike targets that a small surgical hostage rescue focused unit isn't necessarily set up for.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're describing the commandos. You know, the commandos.
Yeah.
There was a suggestion just before 9/11, actually, that the Special Operations, Australia Special Operations Command should be expanded because of the type of technological innovations that had come with the type of heavy weapons that can be carried by an individual and by the type of communications that can be used. So they thought that that the force structure would benefit from having this sort of direct action, sort of hyper infantry style force that could work with the SASR. So they were starting to be stood up around 99, 2000. Then 2001 there was an acceleration, so they could bring the companies on board because they assumed that the commandos might be used in the future. They were sent into Iraq. The SASR were doing a series of different things in the western desert of Iraq, including scud hunting. And the commandos were meant to be their quick reaction force. So they were just across the border at H2 in Jordan. And then they were actually never used, even though there were instances where they could have been used. And that, I think, is the moment where the rift developed between the SASR and the commandos, because the SASR saw them as this force that couldn't be trusted to go out and to be used. Whereas the commandos, they thought they were ready, and they probably were ready. They'd been training up in this close quarter battle. They'd been stood up for a couple of years at that point. And so a lot of the guys within the commandos actually went off and worked as PMCs, especially a lot of the sort of junior NCOs. But then Afghanistan happened. So the Special Operations Task Group, first the Special Forces Task Group and then the Special Operations Task Group, needed guys to come into Uruzgan. So a lot of the guys who had been working as PMCs sort of came in, and they couldn't get the two units to work cooperatively. There are times where they were both on target at the same time, but primarily they didn't work together. And part of the issue was that there were fistfights in the mess. There were like people threatening to kill each other. There was a real runcture between those. There was a lot of fraternity between some of the parts of those two regiments, but there was definitely animus as well. And I think part of the issue.
I was just going to point out, it should probably be mentioned also that these two units were almost pitted against each other by the Australian military in some ways. That you have two soft units. Eventually, they're both given the direct action mission, so they're both competing for missions, which only, I imagine, escalates the animosity.
No, that's right. And then if you look at the SASR, they're doing these coordinate search missions, and they're doing direct action as well. And they're not necessarily designed for that.
Right.
The force structure is that they're meant to be a sort of more surgical and, they are Australia's elite unit. Whereas they're doing something that the commandos are actually kind of like perfectly built to do with their force structure. And so sometimes the commandos are sent off to do things that the SAS would like to do, but they're just by dint of their force structure, the commandos are better suited to do it. And so then that creates this incredible resentment. And the SASR see them as the little brothers, and the commandos are like, our guys are dying also.
The does.
The which one?
I know you've heard that term, the does.
The does? I haven't. What is it?
You haven't? That the SAS guys call the commandos the does?
The does? Can you spell it out?
DOES, like a female deer.
Oh, yeah. The does.
Yeah. And the commandos call the SAS the poo-poo barrows. I've heard that.
I mean, it's all...
A little sophomoric, yes, but...
That's the thing. 15 years later, it seems so infantile, but at the time, it's life and death,
Yeah.
It's like super serious stuff. And some guys did go over, some guys do the commando, work as commandos and then do selection and go within the SAS, but it never really it never really disappeared, the animus between the two units.
Let's also talk a little bit at this point about some of the structural issues within the Australian Department of Defense. There's some really interesting stuff in your book. I mean, you talk about a lot of breakdowns that happen, but one of them that especially strikes me is that it feels like at some point civilian control of the military was lost. And even commanders in the military didn't understand what their own force was doing. Like there's one quote in your book where I think you said it was the commander of Australian Special Operations saying that capture kill missions are an invention of the media, which is either a lie or it just speaks to the complete obliviousness of the chain of command.
I can answer that one. It's a lie.
Okay.
I mean, it's atop the patrol reports. It's like everybody knows the nomenclature. The problem in Australia, I think, at that time was that there was this culture of bullshit because Australia had to be involved in the war in that it was very important for us to be a good alliance partner with the US. And we always wanted to be a good alliance partner. We have always wanted to be a good alliance partner. Not only that, when you go a little bit further down the command structure, there was this technology transfer and this skill transfer that was happening as well, because we were eventually working as a sort of fungible soft force, or they were working as a fungible soft force. So they were sort of, from a modular perspective, becoming useful within an American structure, which was good for the Australians. They were upskilling very quickly. But the Australian public, the political class, would not accept the Australians doing the things that the Americans were doing. The major thing that I sort of lean on from an ethical perspective in the book is that the Australians were doing these kill capture missions, and the ROE allowed them to directly target individuals, which is basically an assassination, without any attempted capture, whether they're armed or unarmed. That there is no way that would have been accepted if a politician explained to the Australian public that was what was happening in Afghanistan. So there had to be this sort of top level layer of bullshit between public-facing information from the highest people within government and within the military, saying that this mission is really about standing up an Afghan battalion. It's about protection of women's rights. It's about all these things. Whereas all of those strategic goals had gone in Uruzgan by probably about 2009. It just wasn't happening. Everybody on the ground knew that wasn't happening.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but there is in your system there is a chief of defense, which is a military officer, and there's a minister of defense, which is a civilian. So when the civilian is saying, I can't get information out of the military, I'm not getting all of the information I need, I don't know what's going on, is that a lie, or is that part of that public-facing propaganda, if you will? Yeah,
well, I mean, that's a direct quote from a defense minister who I interviewed for the book, and that was one of two defense ministers who told me that they couldn't get information from the military. And so, in a democracy, that's completely unacceptable. But I think the department and the ministry, there were some things that they didn't want to know. So they had they'd sort of punted on some information. They had empowered the military to do certain things without any understanding and oversight. And then when they do want information, they've already created this system where it's difficult for the ministry to get information. So the ministry has plausible deniability, and it's the same with the department as well. This is speculation, but this is the way. This is, I think, one of the issues. So yeah, there was a major issue. There may well still be a major issue within the Australian government that there isn't as much civilian oversight as there should be. But to go back to my point of that sort of layer of bullshit that was at the top, that sort of dripped through all the way down to the ground. As long as we're already not being transparent about our strategic goals, and so then when we're not transparent about what the specific types of missions are,
even internally,
and then we're not specific with our patrol reporting, so it just dripped all the way down.
So moving on to some spicy content here. Not particularly.
Bring my lawyer in. Hold on a second.
Yeah, exactly. Not a particularly great moment for the SAS. Tell us about the moment that they were flying a swastika in Afghanistan.
Well, that was actually the commandos.
It was
correctly identified in that book. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me.
So, yeah, they were out on operations, and I mean, there has been this issue within. I mean, the soldiers probably wouldn't necessarily see it as a problem, but there is this sort of impunity within some of the units. In that there were rules that were allowed to be bent and rules that were allowed to be broken. Like, one of the obvious ones is drinking.
Sure.
So the SAS had a bar in Tarancot. You know, they're not meant to be drinking, and they have a bar, and all the generals went there. You know, like everybody went to the bar. They actually, famously in the book, one of the sort of signature war crimes, or one of the things that's being contested in this defamation case at the moment, is whether there was an execution of a disabled Afghan who had a prosthetic leg. Yeah. And then that ends up becoming a drinking vessel in the bar that the SASR had. So that was sort of allowed. So nobody really knew where the line was. And so somebody thought that the line allowed swastikas to be flown on operations. I was told by lots of people that it was a joke, but then I've subsequently learned that guy was actually a Nazi and part of a sort of Nazi group within another regiment before he came to the Special Operations Command. I very much doubt that the other guys around him, were of that.
But they certainly saw it. They certainly saw it.
They flew it.
Yeah,
they saw it. Yeah, and one of the other issues with that photograph is there's a major there who ended up becoming a very senior soldier and was someone who was on a track to end up being chief of defence. And the guys that I spoke to about that major, I said, well, why didn't he rein them in? Why did he stop them from doing it? And he's like, well, he didn't like it. He was obviously upset about it, but he didn't feel at the time that he could rein in a sergeant in that way, which is a problem.
That's a perfect segue, because I want to ask you next about officers losing control of the SAS and how that kind of came about. Yeah.
I mean, one of the problems with the officers in the SAS is that they come in and out of the regiment
so quick.
And having a successful period in the SASR is hugely important for your career, especially if when you're on on a sort of combat deployment. That really is your opportunity for advancement in career and the chances for medals, and having that on your resume is hugely important. And within the Australian military, there has been a long succession of people who have gone through the SAS and then have gone up to the point of our Governor General, who's the most senior person in the government, is a former SAS officer. So it's very important for an officer to have a successful deployment. But if you have your sergeants and your corporals in open revolt because they're upset about the things that you're doing, and these are guys who have sort of set the tone and have a greater understanding of what the ground truth is, then that's gonna be a problem in your career. So that means that officers who want to go against something that may be unethical would take a massive amount of moral courage. You would have to go against the entire system. Like the special operations task groups are relatively small. So if you're an officer and you think that one of your patrols is doing the wrong thing, and you rein them in, or you bring in, charges, or the IGADF, which is basically our military police, to investigate these types of things, you'd probably create a CSOPS. So you might even create like a political issue.
Right.
So it was incredibly tough for the officers to do that. But then before that, they actually have to understand what's happening in the first place. So quite often they're in this sort of like Overwatch position. They're not necessarily on the ground. With this defamation case, we had a lot of officers coming in instances where there had been suspected war crimes, and they're like, I don't know, it blew in and there were some dead people. What can I tell you?
In the book, you talk about how the SAS came to have a tribal culture. I mean, one of the operators you spoke to described it as a Lord of the Flies culture. where they were sharing kill videos with one another, where there's this kind of stonewalling of any acknowledgement of PTSD within the regiment. Can you tell us about how that developed?
Yeah, I think that quote might actually come from the unit psychologist of the SASR. But that sort of linger culture, that's how they would describe people who would suggest that they had a PTSD issue. A linger means that you're a malingerer, so you're not taking on the duties that you should be taking on, and you're basically letting everyone down. The way that it was described to me over and over again is like a motorcycle gang. It's like you do not break the trust of the guys within the motorcycle gang.
It's like a mafia.
But then also, coercive violence is something that was kind of enforced a certain structure there as well. So, guys could be beaten, guys could be slapped. It could be, for some people, it could feel dangerous breaking outside of that code of silence. And there was an instance in Australia where somebody's house got blown up because they had fallen afoul of this code of silence. I don't necessarily understand how it developed, but there were people who sort of talked to me about coming into that environment, because when you come into Campbell Barracks and you come into the regiment, that's the top of your career, whether you're an operator or whether you're an officer or whether you're a physio or whatever you are, especially in a time of war, you really want to do the best job. And everybody's super intense, and you're like, that's okay, I understand this, because this is a time of war, so I want to do the best job. But there were, like you said, there was this, the psychologist described it to me as a sort of tinderbox ready to blow. The fact that there were a lot of instances of domestic violence, a lot of people getting super drunk, a lot of people assaulting people at pubs, a lot of like death porn being shared as well, like sort of weird snuff porn, a lot of kill videos, a lot of photos of heads being blown off and stuff like that. Like at some point, a sort of responsible adult should have come down and said, okay, we need to clean this up for the benefit of the people who are within this structure. Not to be a dick about it and tell everyone, hey, you're all getting detention, but just this is going to be healthier for everybody, and we're going to be more effective as a fighting unit if we do clean this stuff up.
You write in the book about how, as time goes on, the culture of the unit changes, and guys are sort of deferring on advancing their career because they just want to be gunfighters, like they've gotten addicted to the combat. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea is that, you're a patrol commander, and then you sort of work your way up and you become a warrant officer, and you sort of spread the experience that you've had across the regiment and sometimes across the military as well. It's meant to be an area of excellence, and it is an area of excellence where they can go out into the greater defence force and sort of bring some of that excellence with them. But because I think so many of the guys became addicted to the combat, and we don't have any sort of solid numbers on what the level of PTSD is, but the psychologist explains to me that he said, the literature that we have suggests that it's not accumulative, it multiplies. And so when you've got guys who've done these sort of 8, 9, 10 combat deployments, and that is the number that guys ended up doing, SASR guys, and I can imagine similar with the Americans as well. So they're in these sort of, intense environments for, 10 deployments might be 6 months each, it's 5 years, like it's a super intense thing to do. They just want to go back in because that's the place where they feel comfortable. They start to feel uncomfortable in a civilian environment. Mm-hmm. And that was the case with the commandos as well. There was lots of guys whose, their lives were falling apart to a certain extent outside of their deployments. They're having problems with their wives, or their friends. They didn't relate to their friends anymore, or so they just wanted to get back out. And just being a warrant officer and working a QCB course for the rest of your life is not as exciting.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the One Commando operation in 2009, where it's sort of like the first time if I'm understanding correctly, that the issue of war crimes starts coming into the public. Like there is some aspects where they might prosecute this guy, they might not.
Yeah, yeah, that was a sort of a very important sort of forgotten part of the Australian war crime story. So by 2009, we'd had 3 years of these deployments of commandos and SASR, and everybody was getting fatigued, and they basically needed to re-up some of the guys who they were bringing into the 2nd Commando Regiment, especially, and the SASR. So they decided to do a deployment of 1 commando guys who are reservists. This is Australia's oldest continuous special forces regiment, but they hadn't been used in operations for such a long time. So a lot of these guys, some of them are soldiers full time, some of them are policemen, some of them have other jobs, and so they did pre-deployment readiness, which supposedly was a little lacking, and then they were sent to Uruzgan, and then they were doing the kill capture missions. So there was a house actually again in the place where Chora and Baluchi, and I think it was into actually Darafshan, so it was very close to Tarankot, and they were going to be this compound of interest, and they were doing a night mission. I think it was sort of midnight, 2 a.m., something like that, and they go to this house and they find it empty, and so they decide that they're going to just go to the house next door and do that house instead, which they had already had. There was an ISAF order that they were not allowed to do that. You weren't just allowed to go into an adjacent compound because you had some intelligence about a certain compound. Anyway, so they went into this house, and this is something that you have to be sort of relatively legally wary about. But I think it's uncontroversial that there was a guy who was there with his family. He heard someone breaking into his compound. He got his rifle. One of the soldiers saw him. They shot him, and then they hadn't killed him. He was shooting through a door. A machine gunner fired into the room where him and his family were. And then afterwards, this is the part that is somewhat controversial, is some have suggested that there was a ceasefire call. Some have suggested that there was still shooting. It's contentious, but grenades were thrown in and some babies were killed, and some children were killed. The most interesting aspect of that is what happened next. At the time, the Australian military had this independent judiciary that was beyond the chain of command. So there was a brigadier who got a brief from the IGADF and believed that this was a war crime. And so she was going to prosecute the guys, and she was going to prosecute Lieutenant Colonel who ordered the 2nd house to be assaulted. And so she tried to go through this prosecution, and the Australian media were very upset by it, and the chain of command were very upset by it. And eventually she was chased out of the army. And there was a ruling that was made in court that previously it was assumed that the soldiers owed a duty of care to civilians in Uruzgan. Mm-hmm. And then a ruling was passed down that there was no obligation to have a duty of care for civilians. And she was quite upset by this brigadier, who was the chief legal officer of the Australian Defence Force at the time. And she said that she thought that they were creating new law with this ruling. The guys didn't end up being prosecuted. And so that was the standing rule afterwards, that the Australian forces did not have an obligation of duty of care over civilians.
And then another controversial operation was an assault. I believe the target was called Whiskey 108.
Yeah. Well, Whiskey 108 was the one where the guy with the prosthetic leg was shot. So that's something that's under appeal at the moment. So it had been alleged that there was an assault on Whiskey 108. There was fighting going on between the conventional forces who had a patrol base very close to that compound, and guys who were there in that village, which was Darafshan as well. So it was really close to the place where these one commando killings had happened, and where so much of the Australian war crime story happens, despite the fact that it's this tiny little area with not that many people living there. There had been a battle. They called in an airstrike. They'd blown up a compound. The SAS come in, and they either kill these guys legally or don't kill them legally. But there were news reports saying that they hadn't killed them legally, that Ben Robert Smith had either executed or ordered the execution of a couple of these guys, including this guy with a prosthetic leg. And yeah, that's under appeal at the moment. So that's the first instance of SAS murders being reported, because that happened, I think, in 2009.
Out of curiosity, kind of or I guess leading into the idea that maybe he was or wasn't executed, who was he, or who did they think he was? Like, was he just was he just a random guy on target, or did they think that he was somebody who had been evading capture and that local forces wouldn't hold?
Well, in that defamation case, somebody actually suggested that he was a JPEL target, and he was objective xiphoid, and he kept explosives. He was known for keeping explosives in his prosthetic leg. I think we can fairly safely discount that that was the case. I don't think he was that Bond villain. But he and the other guy who was killed in this is the center of this defamation case. They had come out of a tunnel, and in the tunnel there were weapons. The major issue in Uruzgan, though, is that they were almost certainly local militia. But were they? And they were probably local militia who were shooting at the Australian conventional forces. But do you want to kill all of your local militia who are aggrieved by putting up a patrol base near your village? That's the question.
And the only reason I ask is, and it's not to justify a killing if the killing is true, but I'm curious because in my mind, there was like a significant difference between a killing of a guy who just happens to be on a target or in a house next to a target, and killing a guy who is a suspected IED maker who has been rolled up a few times and released every time. And again, I'm not justifying it. I'm just asking if there was something in their mind that for them that justified it.
Well, that's the difference between an ethical question and a legal question.
Right.
Because regardless of whether this person's a civilian or whether they had been previously a combatant, once the person is ordered to combat, if you kill him, then that's murder.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think, my instinct is that the Australians were not just randomly killing people on target. There may have been a couple of instances where they did, because they got later on in the war, they believed that there were places where they were just full of shit people. They called them shit cunts, and in certain villages, it's just like all the guys in this village are shit cunts. And I don't know whether you're following the British inquiry that's going on at the moment, but there has been evidence proffered that the British SAS in Helmand, in some villages, killed every fighting age male that they could find on certain targets. But I think primarily the Australian SAS, if they had killed people illegally, they generally believed that they were combatants. But
from
my perspective,
go ahead, please.
Well, no, from my perspective, one of the major issues of Australian operations in Uruzgan was an over-aggregation of the enemy. I think that you have to be very selective, in coin operations as to who you decide to target. And I think there was a sort of maximal approach sometimes in regards to some places.
Yeah. And again, like talking about like the legal versus the ethical, I absolutely agree with you. It's just, sometimes it's when it's reported that somebody was killed, in custody. A lot of times I think there's a deeper story to it than just, these guys are savage, or the coalition forces, U.S., Australian, whomever, are just savages off the rails in their minds, even though it's not legal. In their minds, it makes sense.
I think there probably were some people who had bloodlust. And I think there were a lot of people who perhaps thought they were doing the right thing. But from a strategic perspective, it's not a smart thing to do. You're not getting closer to your strategic goal. If your strategic goal is pacification,
right?
If your strategic goal is, getting a pat on the back from a certain person who wants you to kill as many people as possible, then that's different. And that's why I've been arguing for there to be a royal commission in Australia into these killings, because I think that they're poorly understood. And I think that we should understand the link between the civilian structure, the department and the ministry, Special Operations Command and the soldiers on the ground, because I think there is this sort of connected picture that doesn't exist in the public consciousness in the way that it should.
And there's a real scenario in these wars that I think that Western societies were not ready for, in the sense of if you take like an IED maker, a bomb maker who never places the bombs himself, he pays farmers, he gets rolled up, but because of the local justice and how it is, he gets bought out of jail every time he gets rolled up. And then he hits coalition forces. He's known for the death. It's like, how many times do you want to roll this guy up just for him to be released over and over again? And I think that a lot of the soldiers on the ground got frustrated in those situations. Like, how he is an enemy combatant. He may not be shooting at me right now, but he'll sure as hell blow me up tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's definitely the issue in Australia. There's a chapter in the book, and I describe the sort of porous Afghan justice structure,
right? And
the fact that there was this sort of this ability to certain people to take people out of the legal system, the Afghan legal system, unitarily, just because of the power that they had, and then recycle them back onto the battlefield. And there was an incredibly admirable effort by some of the Australian army lawyers and some of the soldiers and the reservists to create this thing called the rule of law cell. So they tried to sort of train a lot of the soldiers, the SAS guys and the commandos, to basically work as forensic investigators and then build up the courts so they could get the prosecutions. Yeah. And part of the reason, there's a quote in the book from one of the guys who was setting up this rule of law cell saying, we thought it was a good thing to do to the soldiers because, it's just not good for the soul to be endlessly killing these people and have this rage about these people who are combatants and we're not legally allowed to kill them. But from my perspective as a civilian, so this is something that I sort of stress over and over again, is I'm just an impartial observer.
Sure.
If I was a soldier, I'd have a completely different perspective, I'm sure. But from a civilian's arm's length look at this thing, if that is the case, that we are recycling these guys and then the guys are like, fuck it, we have to kill them, we have to protect those guys from doing that, because if they do that, they may be subject to Australian laws that might put them in prison for the rest of their life.
Right.
And if we are doing that, we have to articulate to the public, these are why we're killing these people, this is why we're doing it, and we have to link it all the way up to some sort of strategic goal that makes sense for Australia. Yeah. And I think they failed in that obligation.
Ben, could you tell us a little bit about the SAS's undeclared 4th Squadron? I thought that was an interesting fact in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know that much about 4th Squadron, but I have spoken to some of the guys and they can't talk to me that much about it. But it's sort of an intelligence gathering squadron. They are sort of the most technologically capable of the squadrons. And they have this grey role. It's meant to be a sort of clandestine role as well. So one of the tensions that they had within the SAS while they were on operations in Afghanistan, when there were so many guys on operations in Afghanistan, was that they only had so many soldiers. It's a relatively small regiment, but they were trying to bring these guys into this grey role. So the issue started at selection. So say it's 2009 and you're in the middle of war in Afghanistan, and that when you have someone that you have selected and then you're going to put them in the Rio cycle, that they're going to go into combat with guys like Ben Roberts-Smith against the opposing forces in Uruzgan. You want them to have the capabilities to succeed in that environment. So one of the guys in the book describes the tension within selection there is because we want these big scary gunfighters to do this type of direct action stuff, and so we are selecting for that, and we're selecting for these sort of like ruthless killers, these Cameron Baird types, actually, sort of frankly, within the SAS. But there is a tension because there's people within the SAS that are looking at the sort of strategic future of the regiment, and they're like, well, we need these sort of weedy dorks who just can walk on any street and just don't look like anyone.
Right.
Like Ben Roberts-Smith there's only certain environments in which he can sort of walk down the street and look normal. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with him, but he's 6'5", 120 kilos, something like that.
Yeah.
He's a giant. He looks like a VC recipient. He looks like a soldier. Whereas you need these guys who are going to be sort of low pro. So even from a perspective of selection, and the way that the SAS they rotate through to 4 Squadron and then also to the counterterrorism tag capability, you need someone who can sort of do everything. So they were selecting for these guys in Afghanistan. And the other issue that they found, and this is something that one of the people who was doing selection was, he was doing the psych screening for these guys, is that they were trying to weed out as many as they can, but they weren't weeding out everybody who wanted to hunt and kill people, because they knew that that's what they were doing in Afghanistan. So there were people who were going into the SAS because they knew at some point they'd be able to go on target and start doing these kill capture missions.
So there's an interesting sort of vignette that maybe not a lot of people are aware of, where the Special Operations Task Group, the Australian Special Operations Forces, they have a team up with DEA, American Drug Enforcement Agency, FAST teams in Afghanistan. Yes. Can you tell us about that relationship?
Yeah, I mean that came of the tension between the SAS and the 2nd Commando Regiment. There was a lot of contention as to who would get the air assets, because Australia didn't bring its own air assets into Afghanistan, so we had to use pool helicopters and pool ISR, and so there would be these air windows where the SAS would go and they'd have their air window, so they'd take their helicopters out and do missions, and then there were periods where the commandos had their air window, and if there was bad weather or something like that and somebody missed a day, the regiments ended up hating each other because somebody else would get their helicopters. And so the commandos are like, well, we need to find our own helicopters. So I think I have told this story. I can't remember all the details, but I think it was actually at a funeral. Someone met someone within the DEA, and the DEA said, we're running our own helicopters. We have, these old Russian helicopters, and we have these guys that we call the expendables, who these sort of like, some of them flew in Vietnam, these sort of contract pilots that are working for the DEA. So why don't you come and work as gunfighters for us? And it was this really fruitful relationship in the context of they managed to destroy a lot of drugs, they managed to attack a lot of drug labs. There was a lot of fighting, but there has been a lot of questions as to whether that actually. The idea was that they were going to take money away from the insurgency. That's why they were doing these drug missions.
Right.
But there has been a lot of suggestions since that basically they were just working for the benefit of other drug lords who weren't being attacked.
Oh, interesting. But do you, like intentionally, or that the other drug lords were just feeding them the intel so that they would go like take out the...
Some of them were feeding them the intel. Some of them had political connections, especially connections to the Karzai family. People who were working with the coalition in Uruzgan and Helmand, because most of these missions were conducted in Helmand. But they were, this sort of leads into or goes back to the political disconnect. Mm-hmm. I think if the Australian public really knew the way that these drug missions worked and the way that the DEA worked, they probably wouldn't have allowed it, especially considering that we had this strict mission and the strict parameters under which the Australians could operate. Yeah. But there was this sort of tendency towards action. So the commandos went and did these missions, and and there was a lot of action. They really enjoyed it.
For were the Australians under the same strictures like the U.S. forces in terms of like the capture kill? If they're captured, would they just go into basically a coalition detention facility or to the local authorities? Or what did the Australians have something else set up? Generally?
No, they had their own facility later on, but then they would go into local detention afterwards because they had to go through Afghan courts. Going back to the drug missions, they had a certain rule of engagement, a certain set of rules of engagement that was distinct to the other missions that they were doing.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, are you guys familiar with the ROEs that the ISAF was using in Afghanistan? I would assume you would.
Yeah, I mean relatively so.
There were different ones at different times.
They changed all the time, so like they changed like week to week.
Do you know, so there's 429 ROE, 429 A and B, which are the offensive ROEs, as is my understanding. And then is there 429 ROE E, which is the direct targeting ROE, basically,
I,
the
I
kill
honest
capture
to
mission?
God, I honest to God could not tell you. And those ROEs became so complicated from what I've been told. It was like a stack of 3-ring binders this high,
Yeah.
and a very, very small group of people really had any, mostly JTACs actually, had any sort of understanding of how they worked.
And I think that the ROEs actually differed.
There was a NATO ROE,
Yeah, they differed
and then
from
there was a
unit
soft
to
ROE.
unit. Yeah, there was a soft ROE. So they also differed from unit to unit. It was insane. It was insane.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that there is speculation that that's going to pop up in the criminal cases.
Yeah.
There has been one SAS guy charged for murder.
Yeah.
And it's on video. I'm sure you guys have seen it.
Yeah,
where
yeah.
He's standing over an Afghan and says, "Do you want me to drop this cunt?" and kills him. And there is speculation that they're going to mount a defense that they believe that killing was within a certain ROE as it was explained to them. That's part of the Australian issue, is that everybody has told me what they believe the ROE that they were operating under was, and quite often it's quite different.
I honestly
Yeah.
don't, outside of like Jack mentioned, the JTAC, because the JTACs, like their job depended on knowing the ROEs, because they were waiting, like their fire came from higher headquarters, right? Who the attorneys were sitting there. But for the average Joe on the ground, whether it was SAS or 10th Mountain or Special Forces or whoever, they have their general ROEs, like you don't you don't shoot somebody who is a non-combatant. Like they have the general, but at any given time they could have been breaking ROEs because they changed so frequently.
a little vignette. I mean, I was deployed with Special Forces in 2008 or 2009. I never saw an ROE.
Yeah.
We asked for one too.
Yeah.
And we were never given it.
For people who are watching, listening, who might not, you can probably get it from context, but an ROE is a rules of engagement, and it basically tells a soldier why they can shoot at another person. And you would think it seems like a simple question, but it gets very, very convoluted.
Yeah. It becomes like, how big is the structure? Can the structure be reduced? What is the acceptable civ cast, if any?
Right. And it's armed combatants. Okay, you can shoot at somebody who's armed, or what if he doesn't raise his weapon at you? What if he's not shooting at you?
What if he has his cell phone and there's intelligence that there are spotters in the area? What if the guy tries to steal your Humvee? What if he tries to steal a radio that has encryption?
What if he's running? What if he doesn't have a weapon, but he's running off a target where bad guys are, and he's running towards a known location of a weapons or suspected location of a weapons cache? Like it gets very convoluted.
It sounds like civilians would think, well, it's kind of obvious, right? He's a bad guy or not, right?
Yeah.
But it gets very convoluted very quickly.
Yeah.
Especially when everybody's ununiformed, and there are certain groups that you could directly target. The Taliban obviously is one of them, but then there's these other militias, and it's like, is he part of this group or another group?
If only they would have worn uniforms to let us know who they were.
I know, they're so inconsiderate.
So inconsiderate, I know.
Something I want to make sure that we talk about here is I'd like to ask you about the big firefight where Ben Roberts-Smith was awarded the Victoria's Cross for. For our American listeners, the VC, that's the Australian or Commonwealth equivalent of our Medal of Honor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was the Battle of Tizak, which was part of the Shawali Kot offensive. Like everything, post this defamation case, there are multiple versions of this. So there was the official version of what Ben Roberts-Smith did. Regardless, it was an incredible feat in which he charged a machine gun post. There were 2 machine gun posts. Killed lots of people. They were hugely undermanned in this Battle of Tizak. But the war crime story has emerged not from without but within. It's been soldiers who are upset with Ben Roberts-Smith. Ben Roberts-Smith has ended up becoming the most decorated soldier since Vietnam. because he was awarded the Victoria Cross, he was awarded the Medal of Gallantry and the Commendation of Distinguished Service. So when he was awarded the Commendation of Distinguished Service, somebody went actually back to TISAC after Ben Roberts-Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross and paced out where he was involved in this firefight, and looked at the official reporting and said that that the official reporting is a little bit skew. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question that he was involved in this incredibly difficult situation.
Do you want to describe a little bit of that, because it sounds like the SAS was engaged in entrenched, dug-in enemy. They were outnumbered, and you write about this scenario where Ben Roberts-Smith and another operator are like kind of in a jam and like are pretty convinced they're about to die.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, they're pinned down by two PKM machine guns. And they basically need to seize the initiative again, so they have to charge across open ground to silence these machine guns and kill these guys while they're getting lateral fire as well, is my understanding. But he did it with another guy who was one of his best friends, who was a junior soldier, and it was contended in the defamation case that this is one of the people that he ordered to commit an execution, and so this person is in their own legal jeopardy. This person is also someone who has a significant psychological issue. But this is also someone who, in the defamation case, says that he loves Ben Roberts-Smith. That he's someone who he really kind of appreciates. But he claims in the defamation case that both he and Ben Roberts-Smith basically did the same thing. That they fought together, to resolve this situation. And that Ben Roberts-Smith was given the Victoria Cross, and this guy was given the Medal of Gallantry after this guy, who hasn't been named, after this guy had been told that he was going to get the Victoria Cross. And an aspect of this defamation case is that after the Battle of TISAC, defence needed a PR win, and Ben Roberts-Smith is a judge's son. He went to a private school. He looks the way that he does. He could speak well to a certain category of Australians, and so it could be argued that this is the point where the rift began.
Let's see, what else do we want to get into here? Oh, there's another operation that struck me from reading your book, that this was a very legitimate, well executed operation, was the 2011 operation where the Australians got intelligence that there was a group of children suicide bombers that were moving into their AO.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems one of the problems in Afghanistan generally was that the Taliban had this sort of area, this deconfliction area in Pakistan, and that there was a porous border. So they basically, there was the Quetta Shura that basically ran the centralized insurgency, and they couldn't be touched. And they basically had this city where they could live with impunity. It was 4 hours away by motorcycle from central Uruzgan. So they could basically go in and out of theatre when they wanted to. And so this is a story that has not been told, and perhaps may not be told because of the compartmentalized nature of some of the information. But they had to sort of build up this intelligence structure that included an understanding of what was happening in Pakistan. So they wanted to, when these guys sort of came in, they wanted to hit them when they'd come into theatre, and they couldn't go into Pakistan. But they had heard that these child suicide bombers were coming in. They got some information in the way that the information is gathered, I know, but isn't detailed in the book and can't be detailed in the book. So they get this information that these child suicide bombers are coming in, and I think they actually ended up neutralizing them without killing them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what's in your book, as I recall reading.
Yeah. I mean, it's my information, but like I said, it's 2 books ago, so there's some stuff I don't remember.
And then the last couple, the like final years of the SOTG, you write about how that's really where a lot of the murders and mayhem, alleged murders, really pick up, and things really get bad.
Yeah, it's 2012 where the sort of bulk of the murders are alleged to have happened. And I mean, it makes sense, from an ethical perspective. we are all moral beings. Regardless of who we are and what we've done and what we think is appropriate and not appropriate, we have this sort of like understanding of what is right and wrong. And if you're leaving Uruzgan having committed so much bodily and emotionally to the fight, I can understand why you believe that you think there are these people who you know that are bad and that the province will be better off if you have killed them. There is no justification legally, and personally I don't think there's any justification morally to execute people. But if you are at the back end of this thing, you've seen so much death, you've had friends die as well, you've killed so many people, you don't want it to be for nothing. You don't want to just be walking away and going, oh, well, we didn't win, especially after spending your entire 30s or like a great chunk of your life to this thing. In Australia and in Afghanistan. That's just my speculation as to what happened. But yes, it happened primarily in 2012. The other thing that I write about in the book is that a lot of the guys talk about the incentive structure that had built up around then. Jackpots was a big thing. So jackpots are JPEL targets who were prosecuted, who were either killed or were in detention, in long-term detention. So if you recycle a guy, you go and capture him and you put him, into the Afghan justice system, and it won't count as a jackpot. But at the top of the mission sheets, it says jackpot, and there's a box for whether you got a jackpot or one or two. And I think the SOTGs were trying to rack up as many jackpots as they could. And I don't know this because this hasn't necessarily been investigated, but I think some of the orders to combat killings may have been JPEL targets to make sure that this person was killed rather than recycle them, that they weren't counted as a jackpot.
One of the things you wrote, actually kind of, even though no one was actually killed in this scenario, there is, I thought this was in a sense the most shocking part of your book was that you write that Ben Roberts-Smith on training exercises in Australia was having the junior operators conduct mock executions. Yeah. And saying, hey, that's how we do it overseas. And that's not something, you can't chalk that up to like in the heat of the moment, we're in combat, things happen. That's very premeditated if it's true.
Well, all of the alleged murders, or most of the alleged murders are premeditated in that drop weapons were involved. So they took weapons on target or radios on target so that when they had executed people, they could, for the SSE photos, drop a weapon or a radio on them. That was evidence that was given at the defamation case by, I think, 2 witnesses who were involved in these pre-deployment readiness exercises. From memory as well, they gave evidence that this had happened in front of lots of people. That these mock executions in the Ben Roberts-Smith has allegedly in this defamation case had said to these junior soldiers, you execute this Afghan because that's how it's going to be over there. And then one of the guys who gave evidence came and picked him up at it later and just said, what the fuck are you doing? What are we doing here?
And then we get into 2012. Ben Roberts-Smith is accused of kicking a guy off a cliff.
Yeah.
What happened there?
A few of the killings, and part of the reason that I think Australia needs a royal commission is that was in the wake of a green on blue killing where a guy called Hekmatullah had been being trained by conventional forces in a patrol base, and he turned his gun on the Australian conventional forces and killed a number of people, and then ran off into the ether. And they had some intelligence as to where he was, but they were sort of a little bit behind the 8 ball. So this is one of the missions where they flew into this area. They were trying to find him, and it's entirely possible that they found someone who had been on a phone who was trying to facilitate his escape, and that they may have decided to take things into their own hand in that context. But that's one of the things that's up in appeal. It was upheld in the original ruling that Ben Roberts-Smith had stood a guy in front of a cliff there was long deliberations as to whether it was a cliff or whether it was an incline or whatever it was. But the judge, which is this ruling is now an appeal, found it credible that Ben Robert-Smith had kicked this guy off this cliff. He sustained some facial injuries, and then he ordered another junior soldier to machine gun him to death afterwards. Going back to that question of things happening in the heat of battle, all of these murders supposedly happened in a permissive environment after, there was no more shooting.
Right. But, and to clarify, this guy was suspected or known to be linked to the guy they were after, Hekmatyar?
Well, I mean, there's been an incredible amount of reporting about this killing, including two relatively famous Australian books. And the intimation has been that he was someone who just sort of blew into this town and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I've been told by multiple people that he was part of a local militia and took Hekmatyar in and basically sent him off north after he'd escaped from this Australian patrol base. So, that's something that might come out in a criminal trial, but yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of it that's just we'll see.
You mentioned some of the ideas for the Australian government and what you think should happen with some of this stuff. How much responsibility do you think that the governments of like Western nations have when we go into these nebulous environments with a rotating justice systems and allow soldiers to repeatedly deploy to these? Like they obviously get to a level of frustration where nothing is changing. And yet the governments themselves and their generals, the military structure, is not sympathetic to what's going on there.
No, that's right.
Do you think there's a solution to that and how the government would handle these types of conflicts going forward?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many times where I was writing Find, Fix, Finish where I was like, why doesn't a civilian reach down, enforce a fact-finding mission to have an actual understanding of the nuts and bolts, especially of the SOTG operations, and then come back, and you probably need some people who are retired military people to sort of, assemble a plan of action to make sure that we are operating, A, in a strategically coherent way, and B, in an ethical and moral way, and C, in a way that's not going to be damaging to your forces.
Right.
There were so many times where I just thought, why does the department or the ministry not reach down? There was a JTF commander. So the structure is that we have the SOTGs, we have all the individual task groups across the Middle East, the Australian task groups. They report to an officer who's in the UAE, and he's the JTF commander, so he's a major general. And then he reports to Australia, which reports to the government. And the JTF commander who I interviewed said JTF commanders quite often didn't even have access to the Australian Special Forces. They were sort of told that they didn't have the required clearance to be around in their compound. So you're never going to have this sort of transparency if you have major generals who are part of the command structure unable to gain access to the soldiers. So I think that it would have been useful if the civilians would be able to reach down and actually speak to the soldiers, not only from an operational level, but from an actual boots on the ground level. What do you guys do? Grab some of these guys and go, what's your day to day? What are you told about the ROE? What are you told about the missions? And then from that, you can build up an understanding of what the strategic picture is and then move things, because there were these firewalls all the way through.
Yeah.
And I'm very sympathetic with the ministers because they are given this political appointment, but then also they do have an obligation to, especially when lethal force is being employed, to represent the Australian public, to represent in a democracy the things that are being done on our behalf. And there was a failure in being able to do that.
It also seems, we were very busy advising the Afghan military and aspects of the NDS, the security apparatus, but we weren't, to my knowledge, there were no coalition forces in the actual correctional system. And it's like that was the leaky hole. And if somebody higher in command in the military or people in governments would have recognized that And because I'll tell you, like, I'm sort of on the opposite side of you in the sense of I know it's not legal, but I do find it ethical. But the thing is, we need to take that situation and make it so that it meets your expectations, right? So that any non-judicial killing is ethical, or I mean, isn't ethical. It isn't ethical.
Slip of the tongue.
yeah. Sorry about that, but isn't ethical where these guys aren't rotating back through, and it's not kind of dirtbags that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as an Australian, all Australian forces have to be subject to Australian law.
Sure.
That just absolutely, because from a moral perspective, these people are citizens. They are going to be fighting in Afghanistan for a certain period of time, and then they're going to be coming out into the community, and they have to be members of the community. If you are going to be pushing the bounds of what is allowed and what is what is legal, there has to be at least some sort of strategic reason for that to be happening, rather than just this is the fight that we're in, this is the fight that we've been sent in. So, perhaps there is more understanding for rule bending if you are an American, because you are committed to this war that you have decided that is strategically important. But if you're an Australian, there's no justification for it if it is just alliance coherence.
I'm agreeing with you on that point in the sense of there shouldn't be rule breaking. But in order for there not to be rule breaking, I think that the people on the ground have to know that the rules will be followed, that when they put a guy away, he's going to stay away. And that's what I'm saying, is that they should, these governments should recognize that there's a leak in their in like the indigenous justice system, and not put the operators or soldiers or people on the ground in the position of making these bad legal decisions.
Yeah, but then also, I agree. I wholly agree. But then you also need to understand that, you're here for a reason. You're in a country that has a porous legal system. It is a country that is tribally based, and the idea of being an Afghan isn't the same idea as being an American or Australian. So there are going to be these things that are infuriating to you, and perhaps recycling targets over and over again is one of those things.
Yeah.
But you have to still be an Australian and American. They're going to be an Afghan. You're not going to be an Afghan. You have to try and understand the motivations, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do, as to why they're doing the things that they do. But you still have to stay who you are. You have to represent your uniform. You have to represent your set of rules. As much as it sucks, as annoying as it's going to be, but you kind of have to do that. And I mean, I think the major sin of Australian operations in Afghanistan is that doing less might have been the right thing to do, because then you could just let Afghans rule the way that Afghans rule.
Right. Yeah.
Tell us about how
that's a tough thing to do.
How did this whole war crimes issue explode into the public consciousness in Australia? How did that come about, leading into the Ben Roberts-Smith now defamation trial, the Barrington report, all of these things? How did that happen? Back home.
Well, I mean, it happened internally. It was there were a lot of sort of squeaky wheels within the command who didn't like that. That a lot of this stuff had happened. There was a moment where a new special operations commander came in and basically said to the guys, "Look, everybody's talking about it. I don't know what year this was. It's in the book. We want to clear the air. This can't be something that sort of drags the command down for the rest of the immediate future. So everybody, you can just write down anonymously on a piece of paper, give me an envelope, and just tell me what happened.
Right.
So then we'll just have a sort of an understanding.
And you said he got like 200 letters.
Yeah, he got like 200 letters, and some of the stuff was the most outrageous stuff. I think it was sort of like a case of Chinese whispers, where lots of people would be like, I had heard that someone that I hate did this certain thing, like done these executions or whatever, and like some outlandish stuff. And I can imagine a lot of the stuff were things that had actually happened. And so they were like, well, how can we reconcile with this? So they brought in a civilian sociologist, which has been hugely contentious, a woman called Dr. Samantha Cromford. And she is essentially a culture expert. And so she interviewed a lot of soldiers about what had happened, and then she filed this report. And the report was meant to be about, the culture. She gave it to the Chief of Defence about the culture within Special Operations Command, but a lot of it was detailing the ethical failings as she saw it within the command. And so the Cromford reports, became big news in Australia. It was very much a big deal. And then the IGADF at that point stepped in, and they worked on a report for a long time as well. One of the issues with that report, my understanding is that one of the issues with that report is that they compelled witnesses to speak. So they interviewed SAS soldiers and commandos, and they were compelled to talk. They couldn't basically take the fifth. And then the report came out, and the report detailed 39 murders, and there were 19 people who had allegedly committed these murders. The report stressed that this wasn't the totality of what we think the war crimes problem was, but these are people who we think can be referred to a prosecutor. And so after that, the Australian government, the Brereton report came out. It was a big day in Australia. The Prime Minister stood up on the dais with the Defence Minister and the Chief of Defence and said, we're all outraged by this. No one's more shocked than I am, blah, 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 saying all the right things. The Brereton report, by the way, said that, while there was some moral failings within the command, it's basically the responsibility of the soldiers who pulled the trigger, which is not how I understand things. But they then built this new body called the Office of the Special Investigators. And so they were then going to build these briefs of evidence from these referrals from the Brereton report, and then take them to the Department of Public Prosecutions, and then these would go through and become trials. But Brereton was 2020, I believe, so it's now 4 years later. We've had one arrest of a guy called Oliver Schultz, and he was the person who pulled the trigger in the infamous video where he's standing over an Afghan youth saying, "Do you want me to drop this cunt?" And then he kills him. There hasn't been any other referrals. There haven't been any other arrests. There was one of the other things that after the Brereton report was announced, the Prime Minister announced that there was going to be an implementation panel, an Afghan implementation panel. So this was going to address all the structural issues and the command issues. So they got these three experts, and they were working on it for a couple of years on the things that Defence might have done wrong. They were meant to table the reports to the government, and then the government were meant to make these reports public. They didn't, so people have had to go and FOI these requests, which is a freedom of information mechanism that's within Australian law, where you can get documents out of government. And then the final report, which I can imagine is going to be particularly damning of government and defence, that hasn't been made public. So the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also our Defence Minister, has been given the report. He was given the report a long time ago. FOI requests have been made. Those requests have been denied, incidentally, by someone who is involved in the revitalisation of defence post-Afghanistan. The Senate, our Australian Senate, has asked for it to be tabled. In fact, they've ordered for it to be tabled. They have twice ordered it for it to be tabled. It's gone to a vote in the Senate. The vote has passed. That report is still not made public. It still isn't available to us. So, years and years and years on, the thing sort of drags on, and we have this high-profile Ben Robert-Smith defamation case where there's no criminal liability in jeopardy. We have this one soldier who is going to be tried for this murder, and then we have this report about defence accountability and what the government of the day knew or didn't know or should or shouldn't have done, and it's nowhere to be seen.
And meanwhile, the war goes on for Australian Special Operations. These guys get sent right off to Iraq to deal with ISIS. Yeah,
that's right. And there was always speculation that the 4 Squadron guys go over to a thing called Gallant Phoenix. Have you guys interviewed anyone who was part of Gallant Phoenix?
I'm pretty sure we have, even if they didn't use that term.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
it's like a collective intelligence gathering in Jordan, I believe, where they tracked all the international jihadi that went over to Syria and Iraq.
Right.
And then, I think there was some targeting.
The TF Hydra with the Brits and the French, and from
Yeah.
what you write about the Australians also.
Yeah, and the Australians as well. So that was an SAS element that went and did that. But then the commandos went on and worked in the strike cells in around Mosul and Al-Assad and Takadam and places like that. And the Australians were actually in a house with Eddie Gallagher when the Eddie Gallagher incident happened. Yeah, so that was SEALs and commandos who were together in Bartella in the Battle of Mosul.
Interesting. And yeah, I've actually been told that the Special Air Service has kind of taken over from the Americans, kind of mentoring the Light Reaction Regiment in the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense given that we're sort of much closer to the Philippines than you guys are. And the Australians, I mean, the Mindanao insurgency issue, I can't remember. Do you guys remember when that was?
I mean, it's still like ongoing.
It's
really.
ongoing.
Yeah.
But I know Australians were over there bringing in airstrikes, and there were JTACs and guys who were sort of in prototypical strike cells there as well. So yeah, I would imagine. I mean, my visibility is with operations in Afghanistan. I'm not finger on the pulse with stuff that's happening now, but that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Do we have questions for Ben?
Yeah. Dee, do you know do we have any Patreon stuff?
No Patreon.
Okay. Let me get to this real quick.
So where do things stand today, Ben, with, like, if you could talk a little bit about the forced disposition of the Australian Special Operations community?
Well, I mean, almost uniformly, everybody I'm in contact with is retired, because I think part of the reason is because that was the party, Afghanistan was the place where you could be involved in combat, and I think there was going to be at least a long interregnum after Iraq. I mean, Iraq was very different. The counter ISIS stuff was not gunfighting, and the people that I speak to are sort of generally an aggrieved group for various different reasons. I mean, there is a lot of unity within the community in that they think that the command piece of the war crime story in Afghanistan should be understood and should be exposed. It shouldn't be that the entire weight of those failures should be on the soldiers of the guys who are on the ground. And so even though, there's a lot of different voices and there's a lot of people who hate each other and, there's a lot of old wounds, I think most people think that there should be an understanding of what the command piece is.
Yeah.
What do we got for Ben here?
M. Corbin, thank you very much. And Aussie Bud asks, how important was BRS's family background in enabling the protection of him? Was there a cultural problem in other squadrons?
There was a cultural problem in other squadrons, but presumably it wasn't as bad as 2 Squadron. So just a bit of background.
They were disbanded, right?
Sorry?
Was that the squadron that was disbanded?
They were supposedly disbanded, but, it's a bit of a black box at the moment.
Really?
So, yeah, Ben Robert Smith's dad is Len Robert Smith, who was a major general, and he was the head of the JAG Corps, I believe, here in Australia. He was the head of a task force, but I think just before the Robert Smith alleged murders. He was someone who was in charge of taking bullying out of the Australian Defence Force, I believe. He was part of a task force doing that. So whether his family, I think it's highly unlikely that his family was sort of directly involved in covering up any of the stuff, and I'd be amazed by that. But I think being someone who is from a background that is what it was, and it may have made it more difficult for people to point the finger and to shine a light. I think the Victoria Cross might have done that as well. So I don't think that there would have been sort of like a cover up in that way, but I think that it would have given people pause to come forward.
Scott G, thank you very much. What's your opinion of David McBride and how he would have had protections under the whistleblower laws with experts testifying, but the government blocked the testimony for security concerns?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So McBride lived just down the road from me, someone that I used to see all the time. If you don't know what he did, he was a legal officer, Special Operations Task Group legal officer who was deployed in 2013. And he was given this rule of engagement amplification. So it was basically new steps that the soldiers had to adhere to use lethal force. And his speculation was that this was because command knew that there had been these murders that had happened and that they wanted to have this ROE amplification. So if it all comes to light, they could say, look, we did what we could. The soldiers were bad soldiers. We'd given this ROE that they weren't adhering to. What can we do? And he took umbrage to that. And there were a few other things. There were an incident in which a soldier was being investigated for a killing, and he didn't believe that the soldier had erred, and that he thought that this was, again, this selective prosecution basically protecting themselves against some sort of exposure as to these other war crimes that had happened. And so eventually he leaked a bunch of documents to a journalist, to an Australian journalist, who published some of those documents. And, you could argue that that was sort of the beginning of all the internal stuff, the Cromford's report and the Brereton report might not have happened, but that there was this public pressure because these documents had been shared on the ABC. And then the Australian Federal Police charged him and the journalist who'd been given the documents with Espionage Act breaches. McBride was found guilty, and you're making reference to the fact that there's these whistleblower protections. David McBride, who's a lawyer himself, and the person who was acting for him, is a very senior lawyer too. They have built this defence, and I can't go into what the defence is because of the way Australian law works. But they had built this defence, and at the 11th hour, some Australian spooks came in and said, you can't present this defence. There's national security information involved, so you can't present this to the court. And so there were going to be witnesses. I had made a submission on his behalf as well that were going to be presented to the judge. And then, this national security information interjection basically meant that he had to abandon his defence and then either defend himself with no evidence or plead guilty and sort of throw himself onto the mercy of the court. So he did the latter. He's waiting in sentencing at the moment, and that is a blight against Australian law that someone who had done something that ended up being a public good. There's been a lot of contentious conversation as to why he did what he did. I think it's kind of relatively immaterial. He did expose these crimes. It's a blight on Australian law that he wasn't allowed
the contradiction in the law is it's factually true that he exposed criminal activity, but it's also true that he broke Australian law by breaking classification. And there's a real problem there that he wasn't granted some sort of whistleblower protection.
But I think the other issue is, yes, that's true, that there should have been some sort of whistleblower protection for him. But when those two things happen, when there are these sort of immovable forces within the law, there should be some sort of public conversation about where we actually should fall. Right. And that never happened. That his trial never happened. He basically, the whole thing just disappeared and he went straight to sentencing, which is what he's waiting for at the moment.
And it also sort of highlights the idea that, yes, reporting crimes or, this stuff is important, but if the state commits the crimes, then it's not. Then the state trumps the crimes.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's definitely something that happens in Canberra. You know, it's definitely an entity that is incredibly good at protecting itself.
Right. So rules for thee, but not for me, kind of. We have.
I mean, my issue.
Go ahead,
sorry,
please.
just going back to David McBride,
please. No, go ahead. Your issue is what?
The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is our national broadcaster, recently did a piece about David McBride, and it wasn't a hit job, but it just wasn't particularly sympathetic to him, and especially the reasons why he made his disclosures, and there is just this. There's this perception. I mean, it's not even really perception. It's just the way that it sort of looks. Is that they ended up being part of the government ganging up on this guy who'd made these disclosures. It's all the individuals that end up bearing the brunt of these things. It's the soldiers. It's always the soldiers.
The institution crushes the person. They crush the soldier.
And it's generally the low level soldier, right?
Yeah.
So it's the enlisted or the 01 to 04 or 03. Yeah. It's
the general.
The generals are fine.
Generals are going to get at worst they quietly retire.
Yeah, and get a multi-million job on some board somewhere.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to take them to task for the lies they told or the people they sent.
That's exactly right. And the way that it worked is, because we had such a poor understanding of what was happening in Afghanistan, everybody was lauded and promoted and given medals for this campaign that lacked direction. But then they were already in those positions when all of the failures were exposed. So they're like, oh, well, I'm already here.
Yeah.
It's like, what do we do?
Yeah. Yeah. I got feels about that. Okay. Scott, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. What do you think of how there are soldiers who post on Instagram describing how, when they were in the 2nd Commander Regiment, they would throw down radios on people they killed to claim they were enemy combatants?
I think I know specifically who this person is talking about and which Instagram they're talking about. And he's a good friend of mine, and he has a tattoo of a radio of a dead Afghan on his arm. Yeah, I actually don't believe that this guy ever actually threw a radio down on a dead Afghan, if we are talking about the same people. And in conversations that I've had with him, he's like, we don't set the rules. The rules are, if we are told that if we see someone with an ICOM radio, we're allowed to shoot them. Those are the rules that we're given. And the tattoo is making reference to the context, which is, you're going to give me shit for the job that I did the way that you told me to do it.
Right.
That's not appropriate. I'm going to do what you told me to do. I'm a soldier. I don't get to make my own rules. I don't get to. Legal officers tell me what the bounds of engagement are. So yeah, that's my understanding of the throwdown stuff that's happening on Instagram.
Yeah. And that's it for the questions on the feed.
Guys, I hope you go out and get yourself a copy of Find, Fix, Finish. This is the best book I have ever read about how elite soldiers come off the rails. Like how does a special operations, a very elite unit, people are specially selected and trained, but also it's a very insular culture. And how does that come undone? How does that happen and why? And I think this book does a really good job of explaining that. Go check out both Find, Fix, Finish, also Mosul and The Commando. I don't know, Ben, do you have anything else that you want to tell the audience out there? Where can people find you? What's the next book coming out?
Well, I mean, this book came out last year. Which is my memoir, which is about recovering from that stroke and that heart attack and then sort of going off and doing the things that I did. So you can check that out. The other book that I'm working on at the moment is I'm working with the Australian cricket captain, a guy called Pat Cummins, on a book about leadership. So that'll come out back end of this year. So, read all the Pat Cummins books that I wrote for him.
Will you hold up the other book again? I'm going to say it for the people who are listening on a podcast. A scar is also skin.
I mean, the good thing is you probably won't be able to find Fine Fix Finish in America, but Scar is Also Skin is like on Spotify and Audible and
Well,
most of
yeah,
this as
I
well,
mean,
so if you want to listen to the audiobooks.
full disclosure, I ordered this book off of Amazon, and it only took like 3 months to get to me. You can probably get it on Kindle quite a bit faster, I would think.
Yeah.
That might be the way to go for most of the folks
Yeah,
out
it's
there.
on Kindle, so yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Or audiobooks for the other books.
Yeah. So on Monday, we're going to be back with Rick Kaiser, who is a SEAL that wrote a book about frogman stories. And then on Friday, we're going to have a retired B-1 pilot here in studio. So
Our first B-1 pilot.
Yeah,
I hope
we'll
he's
be
gentle.
we'll be
I hope
talking
he's
about
gentle with us.
Yeah, we won't be talking about grenades and rifles in that one. It'll be
Yeah.
more of the strategic level stuff. So that'll be interesting. Ben, thank you for spending your Australian Friday morning with us.
Saturday.
No, it's my pleasure. It was great.
It's a
to talk to
Saturday
you.
morning?
Is it Saturday morning or Friday morning?
Saturday morning. Yep.
Saturday
We're at the
morning.
markets now.
You're
some
missing
produce.
all the cartoons.
Yeah. See you guys.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks,
we really
Ben.
appreciate it.
And we'll see everyone else out there next week. Thanks, everyone.